I'm Kevin Behrens, and we continue with our series of lectures on research ethics. This second lecture looks at ethics in clinical trials, and we've broken down into two parts: an A part, which we do now, and a B part, which we can do a little later. The objectives of this session will be that students will be able to explain important ethical issues related to clinical trials, describe the key ethical requirements of the Declaration of Helsinki, and explain ethical constraints on trials involving vulnerable participants. Most well-known clinical trials are those trials of new pharmaceuticals or new drugs, but clinical trials can be more than just that. They can also be trials of any kind of method of treatment. So the National Health Act, South Africa, defines a clinical trial as a systematic study involving human subjects that aims to answer specific questions about the safety and efficacy of medicine or a method of treatment. Typically, trials take place in a number of phases. In the preclinical phase, the trials usually involve pure laboratory work and possibly animal testing. In other words, there's no human participation at this point. When you move into the clinical phase, there are normally three phases, and in each of these phases, they gradually increase the number of participants, and this is obviously done for safety reasons. If there are safety or other problems at any of the stages, obviously the trial will be called off. Clinical trials are mainly regulated in terms of the Declaration of Helsinki and International Ethics Code. Most countries have their own codes of conduct around research, but they rely quite heavily on the Declaration of Helsinki. Under general, the Declaration of Helsinki states that while the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects. The claim being made here is that at no point should the scientific objective override the rights or the interests of individual subjects. It goes on to say that it's the duty of the physicians who are involved in medical research to protect the life, health, dignity, integrity, right to self-determination, privacy, and confidentiality of personal information of research subjects. The responsibility for the protection of research subjects must always rest with the physician or other healthcare professionals and never with the research subjects themselves, even though they have given consent. And physicians must consider the ethical, legal, and regulatory norms and standards for research involving human subjects in their own countries, as well as applicable international norms and standards. Regarding risks and burdens, the Declaration says that in medical practice and in medical research, most interventions will involve risks and burdens. Medical research involving human subjects may only be conducted if the importance of the objective outweighs the risks and burdens to the research subjects. You might recognize that underlying this idea is the moral theory that you have learned about, which is sometimes called consequentialism or utilitarianism. The idea that we should always weigh up the different options available to us and choose the option for action that will lead to the best consequences for all. Helsinki goes on to say that measures to minimize risks must be implemented, and these risks must be continuously monitored, assessed, and documented by the researcher. Regarding compensation, the Declaration states that appropriate compensation and treatment for subjects who are harmed as a result of participating in research must be ensured. Protocols, ethics approval, and oversight. The Declaration states that research protocols have to be provided for all research, and they also have to be approved by a research ethics committee. And this applies to all research, not just to clinical trials. Waivers for ethics clearance can be obtained, but these also need to be obtained from a research ethics committee. Informed consent. Participation by individuals capable of giving informed consent as subjects in medical research must be voluntary. Although it may be appropriate to consult family members or community leaders, no individual capable of giving informed consent may be enrolled in a research study unless he or she freely agrees. This is quite important in our context, in which community-informed consent is sometimes important to obtain, inasmuch as it suggests that even where community consent is obtained, individual consent must still be given by each person involved in a research project. Of course, there are a number of ethical issues around this notion of informed consent. I'm going to discuss just a few of them now. One is a concern around how we ensure understanding when we are dealing with participants who have a limited educational background. And this obviously occurs quite often, particularly in developing world contexts such as our own. And what it requires of researchers is a duty to ensure that they present information in a way that is understandable by those who will participate. There are also issues around language barriers and cultural barriers. Clearly, the way things are understood in different cultures can be different, and language can be a serious problem if one is trying to convey information to people about the research that they will be involved in. There is an obligation on the researcher to ensure that understanding is achieved, and this may sometimes, for instance, require translations or the use of interpreters for language for this to be possible. In a country like our own, we know that many societies in our country place a high value on community, and in communities such as that, it is important sometimes to establish not only that informed consent is obtained from individuals, but also from the community as a whole, and drawing in on community leaders. Very well-known clinical trial took place in the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island in New York, and there are some important lessons to be learned from it, so we're going to turn to that now. During the period 1930s to 1987, Willowbrook was a state-sponsored institution for mentally disabled children. It was originally designed to cater for just 4,000 children, but by 1965 there were 6,000 occupants in this limited space. Senator Robert Kennedy at some stage visited the institution, and he came back saying that the living conditions were so bad that it was like a snake pit. He described it as saying the children were living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo. This led to public outcry eventually, and finally to the closure of the institution in 1987. However, in the period 1956 to 1971, a research study was done at Willowbrook, and the mentally handicapped children were deliberately infected with hepatitis in order to try to develop a vaccine. As you will know, hepatitis is a quite serious disease. Now, permission was obtained from the parents, but the permission was often obtained on the basis that it would guarantee access to the facility. And the facility was extremely overcrowded, and there was a long waiting list for admissions. So often it was a quid pro quo. We'll take your child and we will push your child to the top of the waiting list as long as you sign up for this trial. Critics also claim that the permission letter that was provided, which was meant to give information to the parents, also downplayed the facts and the risks that the children would be subjected to. So what were the ethical failures then in the conduct of this experiment? Well, firstly, the children didn't have capacity to give informed consent themselves. They were children and they were mentally disabled. And then full disclosure was not made. The risks were downplayed. The parents were not given all of the right information. And what that means is that proper proxy informed consent from the parents was also not obtained. Furthermore, there was no justification for the choice of children with disability as participants in the study. They did not themselves stand a chance of benefiting. The principle of justice was simply not upheld. These participants were chosen for convenience sake because of their relative lack of power and their inability to assert themselves in this situation. Clearly, there was also some degree of coercion of the parents that was at play here, inasmuch as they were provided with a perverse incentive to participate in order to get their children into the institution. Some of the consequences of this for research ethics was that it led to a far greater focus on the notion of vulnerability, which up until that time had not yet received terribly much attention. And the idea was that it helped us to understand the degree to which certain groups of people and certain individuals are far more vulnerable, far more likely to be harmed than others, and that these groups of individuals need special protection. Also led to many changes in the laws regarding the treatment of the disabled generally, internationally. And so this is what the Declaration of Helsinki now says about vulnerability. Some groups and individuals are particularly vulnerable and may have an increased likelihood of being wronged or of incurring additional harm. All vulnerable groups and individuals should receive specifically considered protection. Medical research with a vulnerable group is only justified if the research is responsive to the health needs or priorities of this group, and the research cannot be carried out in a non-vulnerable group. In addition, this group itself should stand to benefit from the knowledge, the practices, or interventions that result from the research. So these days, if we are going to do research with vulnerable groups, including children, we do need to realize that there are specific requirements and that it is more difficult to obtain permission. Well, that's all for the A part of this lecture. We'll pick up again in part B.